Before we get started, I do want to note that I will not be including my political opinion in this video. Everything I say throughout the rest of this video is what I've researched about the history of racism. I've looked into everything that I possibly could, and from every angle, and judged it for myself. Honestly, I really don't believe I was that biased throughout this video. Although I will say, screw racism, and that will be all. Let's get started.
Ready, begin.
The Pledge of Allegiance. Everyone knows what it is and everyone knows what it means. But I want to focus on the last part when you describe America. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It's true that we are one nation, and depending on your beliefs, we are under God as well. However, when you look at the definition of indivisible, you can see that this may not necessarily be true. And finally, with liberty and justice for all is a controversial thing to even say. Can we say for certain that these last parts are true? There is a reason I bring this up. Anyone who has looked at the news, read something online, or even just talked to someone nowadays has heard about the variety of topics that plague America. The pandemic, the president, the vaccine, Republican versus Democrat, and climate change are just a few topics that not only me, but most people would consider us as divided on. Perhaps the biggest spout of controversy would be from Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter. Every single time, justified or not, that a story about someone getting hurt or killed by the law enforcement pops up in the news cycle, it immediately becomes the biggest story on the news. This isn't an opinion, it's a fact. Whether or not the officer or whoever committed the act was justified or not is a completely different story. So, knowing this, can the parts indivisible and with liberty and justice for all really be true in this America? Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter might just be the most dividing topic for Americans to think about right now because it has roots in our history and racism. There was racism in America before the United States came around. The colonists that came from the European countries brought slaves and indentured servants to America. It wouldn't be right to call this just racism. This was slavery, owning another person. If you were an indentured servant, you could get your freedom by working, although most times they wouldn't be able to earn their freedom because the work was simply too much. The owners would purposefully set the bar too high for really anyone to be able to pay. Ever since Europeans started coming to America in the 1600s, slaves and indentured servants were flowing in a pretty constant pace, especially in the South. Having people to work on plantations and farms was important for business, so having people you didn't have to pay or barely even feed or clothe was fantastic for business. And this was especially fantastic for a world where people didn't have many morals. This process repeated itself year after year until the time of the American Revolution. For those years, more and more slaves and indentured servants were introduced to the American colonies. The time around the American Revolution brought around a new question for some people. What about the African Americans? To say that everyone supported slavery in those times is wrong. Although support for their freedom or even just their better treatment of slaves was very minimal. The American Revolution did increase the numbers of what would be called the abolitionists, but they were very much still in the minority. The reasons for the American Revolution do vary, from taxes to maintaining their freedom to just wanting to fight the people trying to obstruct their lives. For the American colonies, they were treated different than most of the other British colonies. They paid less taxes, had more freedom for law and judgment, and overall didn't really have anything to do with being British, except for the fact that the majority of their ancestors came from Great Britain. So after the French and Indian War, the British attempted to impose more taxes so they would be paying a similar amount to the rest of the other colonies. And they attempted to gain more control over the colonies so that the other rival colonial empires wouldn't try to attack or gain control of America. Makes sense, right? From the American perspective, however, they wanted their freedom. They wanted to govern themselves and choose what was right for them. So they fought the British to earn these rights. These rights that the American people fought for should be for anyone: the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. However, contrary to their beliefs, they were denying these rights to millions of people by keeping them as slaves. I will state this. The people around during this time, whether they owned slaves themselves or simply knew of them, weren't inherently bad people. What they were doing in today's terms is wrong and immoral. Simple as that. However, during these times, it was because that was how they were treated. They were how they were taught and raised. They didn't see it as owning another person because they didn't see slaves and indentured servants as people. But this was slowly starting to change. After the conclusion to the American Revolution, and as people were starting to figure out what to do next, a group of people saw the hypocrisy in fighting for their freedom when they themselves were restricting the freedom of another group of people. As the number of people who saw the hypocrisy in their own freedom increased, some were willing to do something to help those people that were stuck, whether by hiding, smuggling, giving food or clothes, or even just giving advice. These people helped the slaves who were trying to escape and move to either Canada or Mexico. Eventually, certain routes were set up and paths were created so people could follow the path of the ones who escaped before. These routes collectively came to be known as the Underground Railroad. There are just so many stories from the Underground Railroad, and most are exaggerated to some degree. However, even with the most exaggerated stories, some have their base in truth. But most of the time, the escaped slaves were given a place to stay for the night or just some food. Only a minority of stories have people actively walking and guiding the escaped slaves across the United States. The early to mid-1800s had a lot of slaves fleeing, hiding, and sometimes even being caught and returned by slave hunters. This process would repeat over and over again for years until around the 1850s. Well, actually, it's hard to determine when things really started to change, but if I had to make a timeline, I would say the buildup started around the 1820s to 1850s, and then after 1850 is when things really started to ramp up. In the North during the 1820s to 1850s, people actually started to rely more on technology rather than using slaves, or more commonly indentured servants. But the South was actually still full of slaves using the technology, like the cotton gin. There are plenty of theories about why the North was more open than the South, but this video isn't about theories at all. During the 1850s, slavery became political. Actually, politicians started to care about slavery way before now, closer to the early 1800s, but starting in the 1850s, you couldn't be in office without everyone knowing where you stood. These politicians had to choose a side and fight for that side constantly. Eventually, as we all know, this led to the Civil War. There were a lot of reasons the Civil War happened, and slavery was one of the main ones. The Southerners, mostly plantation owners, wanted to protect their source of free labor and their business. To do this, they needed to protect slavery. Some Southerners may have truly thought or even fought because they believed slavery was something they should be allowed to do, but in the end, most people fought to protect their business and what they saw as their property. The people in the North, however, wanted more rights for slaves. Well, actually, the war was unpopular with the northern people, but eventually people came around to the idea of protecting the Union, and as is common during war, the people became more radicalized. Instead of just wanting to protect the Union or more rights for slaves, some started to want full emancipation. And as we all learned in school, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union ended up winning the war against the South. This now meant that all the slaves were free. After the end of the Civil War, there was something akin to a Cold War between the Southern whites and blacks. The Union Army had stayed in the South to ensure that the Reconstruction of the South went smoothly, but there was always a tense feeling flowing through the air. The treatment of African Americans varied depending on where you lived. In some cases, African Americans were voted into political office, and in others, they were highly discriminated against. If you were to create an average African American for this time in our history, they would be able to do whatever the white people could, get a job, hold political office, or even own a home. But a lot of times they weren't given these rights because the Southern whites would give other reasons to stay in race as to why they couldn't use any of their rights. It would be similar to blacklisting someone online. The African Americans couldn't really do anything, so they were forced to go back to the plantations, but instead of being slaves, they were workers paid hardly anything. But this was still legal according to the law. In the North after the war, people weren't as prejudiced as in the South, but it would still be wrong to say that African Americans were treated anywhere near fair. In the now reunited United States, slavery may have been gone for good with the passing of the 13th Amendment, but prejudice was still very much commonplace. People around during the century were fairly divided. Slavery was gone from America, but something only slightly better took its place. The Jim Crow laws had been in place since around the 1870s, but by the turn of the century, it was just as normal as anything else for most people. Segregation and discrimination were the main part of the Jim Crow laws. Separate entrances and exits to buildings, separate bathrooms, and even separate water fountains. When the Jim Crow laws first appeared, some were adopted to keep white people as part of higher society, or to keep African Americans a part of a lower society, and some were adopted because some people still saw the now free African Americans as property that were just trying to get away. I would honestly love to talk about something other than prejudice, but at this point in history, not many people were on the side of African Americans, except for other, more successful African Americans. They say if you have a platform, you should use it, and that's what people were trying to do. People arguing for and against the Jim Crow laws continued for decade after decade. However, nothing could really be done because the people who created these laws were still in office. Actually, it would take a severe jolt to the entire world for several decades before any change could really begin. The early to mid-1900s was full of strife for people. World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II affected everyone. Every single person was affected by these three events. Some way more than others, but you couldn't get away from being affected by them. And yes, there still are plenty of stories of prejudice in America against African Americans. However, the prejudice actually did increase by an extreme amount. It just almost stayed the same as it was before the three major events. There was obviously some extra prejudice. During the wars, African Americans that worked in factories were treated more harshly than their white counterparts, and during the Great Depression, they were denied jobs or service at soup kitchens. However, this could be showing a turning in how people reacted towards African Americans. Or maybe they just didn't care enough to have anything to do with African Americans. That's up to the interpretation because both could be true. Now, after these events, we can see from our history textbooks that we went from the 1940s being about World War II, the 1950s being about the Red Scare, and the 1960s being about counterculture. But what exactly happened? Explaining counterculture, actually, just researching it was really difficult. So I've come up with the conclusion that no one really knows why counterculture started. So I'm going to give my best shot at explaining some of the different ideas. After World War II, many people were scarred or severely changed. Actually, not just those coming back from the war, but anyone who lived through anything up to that point in the century. Then, during the 1950s, people started to get more and better technology because of the different advancements during the war. Now, with people being changed and better access to technology, and therefore media, the children of these people almost lived in another world. The people who would come to be known as the baby boomers because of the extremely high birth rates after World War II grew into this new world of technology. Having access to radio and TV, honestly, this was just a time when the middle class really grew. With this growth and a sense of wanting to do something for themselves, the 1960s started with a sense of tense optimism in the air. People started to become more vocal about segregation, not just African Americans, but everyone. And as more people began to advocate for the end of segregation, people also began to oppose them more strongly and openly. As what happens when you have an idea or a thought that becomes political or mainstream, people chose a side. And as more and more people began to choose a side, more people got more active to strengthen their beliefs. Rallies and peaceful and non-peaceful protests were common means to actively support your belief. However, there are plenty of cases of people purposefully physically harming someone or targeting their lives because of what they believed in. As more people began to choose a side, the idea started to become popular in the government, and eventually the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was put into place as law. Now that the Civil Rights Act was put into place as law, segregation and the Jim Crow laws officially ended. However, you can make people abide by a law, but you can't change their opinion on something. So, officially, racism was over in America. African Americans were given the exact same rights as anyone else with no strings attached. But now we can talk about what's going on nowadays. Because nowadays, there are plenty of examples of people who still harbor discrimination towards African Americans. Actually, you can't call what most people think today as discrimination. If you were to ask someone who harbors bad feelings towards African Americans, you'll more likely find that they are wary of them rather than outright hating them. Even personally, I'm someone who has met a ton of people who could be considered to have bad feelings toward African Americans, but I've never once heard someone suggest that slavery or even the Jim Crow laws need to return. Obviously, this wasn't always the case. I swear, that's gotta be like my favorite saying. After the 1960s, the people who advocated for change grew up and started families, and they taught these families how to treat everyone equally, and the process is repeated until today. People do grow up differently than their parents, but beliefs tend to change the more you hear about a specific side. So since the majority of the people were still anti-segregation, the children of the people who were pro-segregation sometimes ended up changing sides. Not always, and sometimes the reverse actually happened, but in general anti-segregation was a growing faction and the pro-segregation was a shrinking one. Nowadays, segregation isn't thought about at all, but there's something new that's affecting people. Stereotypes. I find it interesting that with a population as diverse as America's, that there are so many stereotypes. I won't be able to talk about any of the different stereotypes because a lot are too complex for this video, but this is the key reason people are more wary of African Americans. Now, I'm not going to come out and say that all stereotypes are bad. Some are actually pretty funny, like how Texans wear boots, jeans, and a cowboy hat, or maybe how if you see someone who's tall, you think they're good at basketball. But there are definitely bad stereotypes, like how every middle-aged white woman is a pretentious Karen, and how all black people are criminals. The last two examples are kind of just wrong. Now sometimes they can have some types of facts around them, like the one about black people being criminals. It is true that black males comprise 34% of the total United States prison population. However, there are plenty of African Americans who aren't criminals. Actually, one stereotype that is correct but used wrong is 13% of the population, 50% of the murders. It's something that I see online often, so I actually went and looked at the numbers. For 2019, there were 10,200 murders in the United States, and African Americans accounted for 5,230 of them. This is in fact about 50%, and African American population is around 13%. So the percentages are completely correct, but it's not right just to look at the percentages and not even look at the numbers. Sometimes it's better to use numbers to show certain statistics, and sometimes it's better to show percentages. This isn't the only stereotype out there. There are honestly too many for me to cover without this turning into a 3-hour-long video, but most people know of the stereotypes and I don't have to say them, they're everywhere. And I won't try to talk about how we can overcome these stereotypes. In the past, only time could actually get rid of stereotypes, so nothing I can say will make them magically disappear. However, these stereotypes and the way people are treated because of them has caused a rift in society, not just for African Americans, but for everyone. The history of racism plays a major factor to show how we've progressed to this point. People went from literally owning people to now sharing their lives with the kin of those people. It would be pointless for me to think about what the future will hold for us and how we will look back to our own history now, Some take pride in it, some take shame from it, but in the end, all we can do is learn. And hopefully, one day, we can truly become one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I hope you enjoyed the video. I don't know what I'll do next time, but I think I'll get another documentary out before the end of the year. Anyway, catch you guys next time. Peace.